Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking on what might be the single greatest political novel ever written, Victor Hugo's Les Misérables.
It's definitely up there, a monumental work.
Absolutely. And our mission today isn't just, to summarize the plot. We want to dig into how Hugo used this massive epic, this incredible story, to really perform an act of historical revisionism.
Revisionism is a good word for it.
Rewriting the very definition of justice itself through the lives of his characters, these unfortunate ones, as he called them.
Yeah, it's such a necessary deep dive because Hugo wasn't just like passively observing poverty. He was putting the system on trial. He was indicting the institutions that create it.
Okay.
So we're really analyzing the text, the history, everything, to answer these three huge questions Hugo seems to be wrestling with.
What are they?
Okay, first, why does misery, actual misery, persist on such a massive scale in a society that, calls itself civilized? Second, what's that critical tension, that almost fatal conflict between rigid, unbending law and, let's say, moral grace or conscience when you're trying to find true justice?
The Javert versus Valjean problem.
Exactly. And finally, can individual redemption, one person changing, and social revolution, changing the system, can those things truly rewrite what we even mean by justice?
Big questions. And to even start answering them, we have to grasp Hugo's central, really radical idea for the time. He doesn't blame crime on personal weakness or moral failure.
No, that was the standard view, but he completely rejected it.
Which was, the conventional wisdom then.
Precisely. Hugo puts forward what we're framing today as the social crime theory. He just flips the script entirely.
How so?
He argues that the individual isn't the root cause of, degradation and vice. It's the societal structure. It's the institutional flaws, poverty, lack of education, systemic discrimination. Those are the real factories producing crime.
Wow. That is a staggering claim for the mid-19th century. It really puts the blame squarely on society's shoulders.
It does. It's incredibly radical.
So it makes sense, then, that his motivation for writing the book was so explicit. We have that powerful quote right from the preface.
Oh, yeah, the famous one.
As long as there is ignorance and misery on earth, books like this will not be useless. He saw this novel as, a necessary weapon.
He absolutely did. A tool for change. And to really understand how he built that weapon, that argument, we're taking a cross-disciplinary approach here.
Right. Not just literary analysis.
No, we're combining political philosophy, literary sociology, but also digging deep into the history and even using memory studies.
Memory studies. How does that fit in?
It's about how societies collectively choose to remember certain events and, maybe more importantly, choose to forget others. How narratives shape our understanding of the past.
Okay.
So we have to put that whole turbulent period, roughly 1815 to 1832 in France, under the microscope. We need to see how that macro history, the big political shifts, directly shaped the fates of every single character, every micro-narrative in the novel.
So if someone like Jean Valjean is a product of his environment, as Hugo argues, then we need to understand what that environment actually looks like. Let's start in 1815. The political trauma seems rooted right there in the failure at Waterloo.
Yeah, Waterloo was, it was devastating for the generation that had lived through Napoleon. It marked the definitive end of that era, the Napoleonic dream, if you like.
And the return of the old monarchy.
Right. The Bourbons came back. Hugo famously, and maybe a bit bitterly, called it the victory of mediocrity over genius.
Okay.
And this Bourbon restoration that followed, it was this huge conservative backlash. But, they couldn't just turn back the clock. The deep social wounds, especially poverty, the foundational issue Hugo keeps returning to, that persisted.
So the attempt to restore the old order just failed.
And it failed to heal the country. And that failure immediately created the sense of political trauma, of promises broken.
Which you see reflected in the novel. It explains the bitterness and the marginalization of characters like Marius's father, Colonel Pontmercy. His Napoleonic heroism was basically erased by the new regime.
Exactly. His loyalties were now suspect. And the restoration policies, they systematically favored the old nobility. They restored a lot of power to the Catholic Church. And crucially, they implemented the White Terror.
Okay, you mentioned that term in the prep, the White Terror. What exactly was that? It sounds dramatic.
It wasn't quite state-sponsored terror like we might think of today, maybe, but it was a fierce, often violent, conservative suppression.
Aimed at who?
Anyone associated with the revolution or with Napoleon, former soldiers, Republicans, Bonapartists. It was about purging the system, silencing dissent, consolidating the monarchy's power. It definitely created a climate of fear and instability.
Got it. So you have this political repression layered on top of economic hardship.
Yes, exactly. Add in the instability from the early days of the Industrial Revolution, new factories, displaced workers, growing class divisions, and you get this explosive mix. The 1831 Alliance Silk Workers' Revolt was a really key early sign.
A sign that things were boiling under the surface.
Absolutely. It showed that the restored old order was fundamentally unstable, that the class conflicts were getting deeper.
And that simmering unrest eventually boiled over into the July Revolution of 1830. Charles X gets overthrown. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a win for the people, right? Another revolution.
It sounded like one. The Three Glorious Days, they called it. But the sources are really clear. It was an unfinished ideal, maybe even a betrayed one.
Betrayed how?
Well, the revolution was sort of hijacked. The new regime that emerged, the July Monarchy under Louis Philippe, quickly became known as the Money Monarchy.
The Money Monarchy.
Yeah, because it very explicitly represented the interests of the wealthy bourgeoisie, the asset holders. They kept these incredibly high property requirements for voting.
You mentioned less than 1% of men could vote.
That's right, less than 1%. So for the vast majority, especially the workers who had fought on the barricades in 1830, it felt like a complete betrayal. Their situation didn't improve much, if at all.
And this disappointment must have fueled more radical movements.
Absolutely. It led directly to the formation or strengthening of these underground Republican secret societies. Groups like the Friends of the ABC, who feature so prominently in Les Misérables, they kept the revolutionary dream alive.
Okay, so that feeling of betrayal, this unresolved tension, this despair, it all culminates in the novel's most dramatic historical setting. Paris in 1832.
Yeah, 1832 is the pressure cooker moment. The city was already incredibly tense. There was a devastating cholera epidemic that spread.
Oh, right.
It killed over 10,000 people in Paris alone, and it hit the poor districts hardest, which fueled massive distrust. People felt abandoned, even suspected the government of poisoning the wells, that kind of thing.
Oh, so fertile ground for unrest.
Extremely. And then the spark comes when General Lamarck died. He was a popular figure, critical of the government. His funeral on June 5th becomes this massive public gathering, and it morphs into an armed uprising, the June Rebellion.
The one Hugo depicts so vividly. But as you said, history, or at least the official version written by the victors, it just dismissed this rebellion, right? Called them a troublemaking minority.
Exactly. It was brutally suppressed within a couple of days and then largely swept under the rug by official accounts, treated as a minor disturbance, an insignificant failure.
And this is where Hugo performs what you called his literary redemption.
Yes. This is crucial. He takes this event, this footnote, in official history, and he massively recreates it in the novel. He devotes huge sections to it.
Elevating it.
Completely elevating it. He transforms it from this suppressed, forgotten riot into a profound symbol of martyred ideals, of the fight for justice against overwhelming odds. He basically grants it an immortal reputation.
Fiction.
Through the power of fiction. The pen proved mightier than the state's attempt to erase the memory.
That act of literary redemption is so powerful. And to really understand the force behind it, we need to look at Hugo himself, his own journey, because it's easy to forget, he didn't start out as this radical champion of the people.
No, not at all. He came from a politically divided family, actually. His father was a general under Napoleon, a Republican. His mother was a staunch royalist.
So conflict was baked in from the start.
Pretty much. And Hugo himself, in his youth, was celebrated as a royalist poet. He got patronage from the king. But, even early on, you see hints of something else.
Like what?
Well, as early as 1829, he wrote a novella, The Last Day of a Condemned Man. It's this intense first-person account, and it already shows this deep humanitarian concern. It's questioning the cruelty, the finality of capital punishment.
Right.
So the seeds of compassion, of focusing on suffering, were definitely there.
Interesting. So the potential was there, but what really pushed him...
The 1830 July Revolution was a big moment. He called it a thought tremor. It showed him the raw power of the people in the streets. But I think the really crucial shift, the thing that maybe deepened his empathy, poured that profound compassion into his writing, was personal tragedy.
The death of his daughter.
Yes. In 1843, his eldest and favorite daughter, Leopoldine, drowned tragically with her husband. It devastated him. It led to years of kind of spiritual reflection, a turning inward, and many critics feel his writing became infused with a much deeper sense of sorrow and humanism after that.
Even as his public career was taking off, he became a peer of France, right? Part of the
He
establishment.
did. He achieved high honors, elected to the French Academy in 1841, made a peer in 1845. But internally, his heart, his politics were moving steadily leftward.
And that move became permanent, irreversible during the next big upheaval, the 1848 revolution.
Absolutely. He was elected as a deputy, initially sort of moderately conservative, but he witnessed the conservative backlash, the crushing of workers' hopes yet again, and that pushed him definitively towards radical democracy.
Then came the confrontation with Louis Napoleon, Napoleon's nephew.
Yes, Louis Napoleon was elected president, but Hugo quickly saw his authoritarian ambitions. He publicly denounced him in the most scathing terms, famously calling him Napoleon le Petit, Napoleon the Small, or Napoleon the Dwarf.
Ouch. That couldn't have gone over well.
Not at all. When Louis Napoleon staged his coup d'etat in December 1851, overthrowing the Republic to make himself Emperor Napoleon III, Hugo didn't just condemn it verbally. He actively tried to organize resistance, calling for people to build barricades.
He was on the streets.
He was trying to rally people. The resistance failed, and he had a price on his head. He was forced to flee France, beginning nearly 20 years of exile.
It's incredible, though, that later, I think it was 1859, Napoleon III offered an amnesty to political exiles, and Hugo refused it. Why? Did he truly believe finishing this novel was more important?
It seems so. He famously declared he would only return when freedom returns to France. He saw accepting the amnesty as compromising his principles.
So exile became his writing retreat.
In a way. It was obviously a painful separation, but it also became this period of intense focus, primarily on the Channel Islands, especially Guernsey. Exile refined his humanism, gave him this kind of global perspective on suffering and justice. And it was there, in that isolation, that he poured everything into completing Les Misérables. It was finally published in 1862.
A massive political sacrifice, really, for the sake of the art and the message.
Without doubt.
And his final years, after he finally returned in 1870 when Napoleon III fell, they really cemented his legacy, didn't they? His response to the Paris Commune in 1871 is interesting.
It is. He didn't agree with the Commune's violent methods, but he deeply sympathized with the workers' demands for social justice. And after the Commune was brutally crushed, he risked his safety to shelter fugitive communards and publicly called for amnesty for them.
Sticking up for the defeated again.
Consistently. And that trajectory, that lifelong identification with the oppressed, it culminated in his state funeral in 1885. It was this huge national event. Millions lined the streets of Paris. But significantly, his coffin wasn't draped in some grand flag. It was covered with a simple commoner's black pall.
A final statement.
A final, powerful symbol of his ultimate solidarity with the people, the miserables he had spent his life writing about.
That deep political commitment brings us right back to the novel itself, and specifically to what you called memory politics, how Hugo deliberately used his narrative to challenge the official story, particularly of that 1832 uprising.
Yes, this is a key part of his project. His core objective, you could say, was to use literature to vindicate those who lost in 1832, to rescue their memory from the condescension or outright erasure by the state-sanctioned history, the history written by the victors.
And he wasn't exactly subtle about it. The sources point out something quite striking. He devoted nearly 1/5 of the entire novel's length just to depicting the few days of the 1832 revolt. That's an enormous chunk of such a huge book.
It's a massive narrative investment. Think about it. He takes what was essentially a small, localized, quickly failed riot, something the official history wanted everyone to forget.
And blows it up.
He blows it up into this epic, almost mythical confrontation. It becomes the symbolic battleground between the forces of social justice and state oppression within the novel.
And he uses the setting, the barricade itself, very effectively.
Oh, absolutely. The street barricade becomes this intensely theatrical space in his hands. It's part stage, part fortress. It's presented as a kind of temporary utopian rallying point, but also the last desperate defense of the oppressed, the place where ideals meet brute force.
And that's where we get those incredibly memorable, almost legendary moments of heroism. They feel larger than life.
They are deliberately amplified. Think of Enjolras, the almost impossibly pure idealist standing alone against the soldiers, or Gavroche, the little street urchin, singing defiantly as he collects bullets under fire, or old Mabouf, the gentle botanist, dying while trying to raise the fallen flag. These are designed to be iconic, unforgettable images.
Exaggerated maybe, but powerful.
Exactly. And that's the core of his memory politics here. Official history dismissed the rebels as anonymous thugs, nameless troublemakers. Hugo's countermove is crucial. He gives them names. He assigns vivid personalities, ideals, debates, relationships to every member of the Friends of the ABC, Enjolras, Combeferre, Courfeyrac, Grantaire, all of them.
It makes them individuals.
He makes them human. This act of naming, of giving them voices and internal lives, restores their dignity. It moves them from being mere historical footnotes, casualties of a failed revolt, into becoming literary legends, martyrs for a cause. The novel truly functions as an anti-official history. It corrects the narrative.
It's a stunning example of literature shaping how we remember the past. That literary victory really sets the stage for unpacking the core philosophical arguments woven through the book, starting with that fundamental idea about where misery comes from, the social crime theory. Can you give us the structural view of misery, maybe using the key characters as examples?
Sure. So the central argument, again, is that misery, poverty, and even vice, they aren't primarily caused by individual failings. They are the result of institutional defects, flaws in the social structure itself, things like systemic poverty, lack of education, deep-seated discrimination.
Okay, so how does Jean Valjean fit that?
Valjean is the prime example. He steals a loaf of bread. Why? Because his sister's children are starving. It's an act born of desperation, of poverty. And for that, he gets 5 years hard labor, which then stretches to 19 years because of repeated escape attempts fueled by despair.
19 years for bread.
19 years. Hugo's point is that the extremely harsh law, the penal system, didn't reform Valjean. It manufactured him into a hardened, bitter, habitual criminal. It broke him, filled him with hatred. That's a classic case of what sociologists would later call structural violence. The system itself inflicted the damage.
And what about Fantine? Her story is just heartbreaking.
Fantine's tragedy is another powerful illustration. She's a young worker, fired by her foreman. Why? Because it's discovered she has an illegitimate child, a moral failing in the eyes of society and her employer.
Just pure prejudice.
Pure prejudice. And crucially, there was no institutional support system, no welfare, no help for poor single mothers. So stripped of her livelihood, desperate to support her child, Cosette, she's forced down this terrible path, selling her hair, her teeth, eventually her body. Prostitution.
Society essentially forces her into it.
Exactly. She's a victim of the double standard of sexual morality. The man who abandoned her faces no consequences, and she's a victim of systemic failure. Society offered her no way out.
Even the minor characters seem to reflect this. You mentioned the Thénardiers earlier. They're villains, obviously. But Hugo presents them differently, too.
He does. They are undeniably cruel and grasping. But Hugo also shows them as products of their environment. Ignorance, grinding poverty, resentment born from their own hardships, like losing their inn. They represent that vicious cycle. Poverty leads to ignorance, which leads to crime. The environment, the lack of opportunity, helped create these monsters.
So this deep structural indictment leads us right into maybe the central conflict of the whole novel. That tension between law and grace, perfectly personified by Inspector Javert and Valjean.
Oh, absolutely. It's the philosophical core. Javert represents the law, rigid, absolute, black and white. For him, the legal code is the ultimate truth, the highest authority. Once a criminal, always a criminal. There's no room for nuance, no possibility of change.
He's the embodiment of the system.
He is. And Valjean, his journey represents the counterpoint. It starts, crucially, with Bishop Myriel. Remember, Valjean steals the bishop's silver.
Right, and the bishop lies to the police to save him.
Exactly. He offers forgiveness, grace, based on his own conscience, not the letter of the law. And that act of profound, unearned kindness is what pulls Valjean out of his cycle of hatred. It sets him on the path toward moral redemption, towards a justice higher than Javert's legal code.
But the ultimate philosophical showdown, the moment where these two forces collide directly, is during the barricade fighting, when Valjean has Javert at his mercy and lets him go.
That moment is devastating. Valjean chooses grace over hatred, mercy over retribution. He repays Javert's relentless pursuit, not with violence, but with an act of inexplicable nobility from Javert's perspective.
And this act essentially breaks Javert.
It shatters his entire worldview. His rigid, codified understanding of justice simply cannot compute this. How can a criminal, someone legally defined as irredeemable, perform an act of such profound moral goodness, even superiority? The law, for Javert, was absolute truth. But here, Valjean, the convict operating from conscience, has demonstrated a higher truth.
Wait, so Hugo seems to be suggesting that a strict adherence to law, if it lacks compassion, if it lacks that element of grace or pity, can actually become a form of injustice itself. That the rigid legal code, personified by Javert, is the thing that ultimately fails.
That's precisely the implication. Javert's suicide, his inability to reconcile Valjean's act with his legal doctrine, symbolizes the self-collapse of pure legal justice when it's confronted with a higher moral reality. Hugo is critiquing a system where law, devoid of pity or understanding of circumstance, becomes blind, cruel, and ultimately incapable of achieving true justice.
Wow. Okay, so beyond this intense character drama, this whole conflict reflects that underlying problem you introduced earlier, structural violence, the sort of invisible systemic harm caused by institutions and power structures against vulnerable people.
Exactly. We see it woven throughout the narrative in so many ways. Chronic poverty itself is presented as a form of ongoing violence, grinding people down. Then there's judicial inequality. The laws are applied much more harshly to the poor, like Valjean, than they would be to someone of means. There's institutional discrimination. Think about Valjean's yellow passport, his convict ID, that makes it impossible for him to rejoin society, to get a job, even after serving his time. Or Fantine's status as an unwed mother.
As society brands them.
It brands them. And there's cultural deprivation, the lack of education and opportunity for street children like Gavroche, trapping them in a cycle of ignorance and poverty. And of course, the ultimate form is direct state repression, the use of the army, the National Guard to violently crush the uprising. It's all part of the systemic pattern of harm.
Okay, so given all this systemic injustice, this deep critique, how does Hugo actually resolve the fight for justice in the end?
Yeah.
It's complex, right? He seems to provide a kind of dual ending.
That's a good way to put it. There's a historical ending and there's a moral ending, and they don't entirely align.
What's the historical ending?
The historical ending is, frankly, one of failure. The 1832 uprising is crushed. The systemic injustices, the poverty, the inequality, they persist. Macro-level social justice is not achieved within the novel's time frame.
That's pretty bleak.
It reflects historical reality. But then there's the moral ending, focused on the individual. Valjean achieves his personal redemption. He lives a life of profound charity and self-sacrifice. And crucially, at the very end, he gains acceptance and understanding from Marius.
Marius, who represents the younger generation, maybe mainstream society to some extent?
Exactly. So Valjean's final reconciliation with Marius and Cosette symbolizes this late acknowledgement, this personal redemption for the marginalized figure. Justice, in a sense, is achieved in the private moral sphere, even if the public political sphere remains unjust.
So the failure of the revolution proves that systemic change is incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible in that moment.
Yes, but crucially, the spark isn't extinguished. The revolutionary ideal, embodied by the sacrifice of Enjolras and the others, is preserved in memory, carried forward by survivors like Marius. It anticipates future change, future struggles. And Valjean's moral victory proves that goodness, that conscience, can ultimately triumph over societal prejudice, at least on an individual level.
And within this discussion of structural injustice, we absolutely cannot overlook the gender dimension. How women experience these systems differently.
No, we can't. Fantine's tragedy is perhaps the most powerful indictment in the novel of society's specific cruelty towards women, especially poor women. She is a victim first of abandonment by her wealthy lover, and then of society's harsh double standard regarding sexual morality.
She pays the price, he doesn't.
Precisely. And then she's crushed by economic vulnerability because society offered absolutely no protection, no safety net, no path to respectable survival for a poor single mother. She was driven inexorably towards prostitution and death. Her story highlights the lethal intersection of gender bias and economic deprivation.
What about the other female characters, like Eponine?
Eponine's story is also tragic, but different. Born into the degradation of the Thénardier family, she experiences a kind of spiritual elevation through her unrequited love for Marius. Her self-sacrifice on the barricade is presented as a noble act, redeeming her origins.
But still tragic.
Still ultimately tragic. Her path reflects the dual shackles of both class and gender in 19th century France. For women like her, trapped by poverty and social constraints, achieving happiness often seemed possible only through connection to a man, like Cosette finding Valjean and Marius, or through ultimate self-sacrifice. There were very few paths to independent fulfillment or agency.
It really drives home how these structures intersect and compound the misery.
Yes, and when you step back and connect all these threads, The individual stories, the historical backdrop, the philosophical conflicts, you see how Hugo uses the novel, uses character fates, to explore and interpret these big abstract concepts from political philosophy. Freedom, justice, the social contract, the failures of the state.
He makes the philosophy concrete, tangible.
Exactly. He puts flesh and blood on the ideas. And his own thinking, it's this fascinating blend, what some call his ideological furnace. It mixes Enlightenment ideals about natural rights with a deep, almost Christian sense of charity and compassion, all filtered through the lens of 19th century romantic idealism.
And that idea of his, the social crime theory, it feels ahead of its time.
It really does. It's striking how it prefigures the work of later sociologists and statisticians, people like Adolphe Quetelet in Belgium, who started using statistics to argue that society itself, through its conditions, essentially prepares a certain amount of crime, that crime rates were predictable based on social factors, not just individual wickedness. Hugo was getting there intuitively through storytelling.
Which makes Les Misérables feel startlingly relevant even today, doesn't it? It's not just a historical novel.
Not at all. It functions as this enduring warning, a kind of cross-era allegory. The fundamental issues Hugo grappled with, poverty and inequality, the fairness of the justice system, social prejudice, the gap between legal and moral right, these are still intensely debated today.
It forces you to ask, have we really solved these problems? Has true justice been achieved in our own time?
Right, it keeps posing that question. And the novel's impact wasn't just confined to France or to the 19th century. Its influence has been truly global, transcending cultures.
How so?
Well, historical sources mention copies of Les Misérables being carried and read by soldiers on both sides during the American Civil War. Its ideas about liberty and oppression resonated deeply there. And it's said to have inspired resistance fighters during the Mexican anti-French War under Benito Juarez.
Wow.
It proves Hugo's own belief that, as he put it, the propagation of ideas is more irresistible than the invasion of armies. The novel became this universal spiritual resource for people fighting for justice.
And thinking about modern ideas of justice, does it connect there too?
I think it does. Hugo's relentless focus, his passionate call to prioritize the plight of the weakest, the most vulnerable members of society, you can see that as a kind of literary precursor to central ideas in modern justice theory.
Like what?
Well, think of someone like John Rawls and his difference principle, the idea that inequalities are only justified if they benefit the least advantaged members of society. Or Amartya Sen's capability approach, which focuses on ensuring people have the real opportunities and freedoms, the capabilities to live lives they value. Hugo horrible theories.
So ultimately, pulling all this together, what we've really established is that Les Misérables isn't primarily about individual saints versus individual sinners. It's more like a blueprint, a passionate argument for dismantling systemic cruelty. Javert's collapse and Valjean's spiritual triumph symbolize the failure of heartless systems versus the power of conscience and empathy.
Beautifully put. I think the core lesson, the final revelation Hugo leaves us with, is this. If you truly want to understand justice, if you want to genuinely pursue it, you must first confront misery. You have to look directly at suffering, at inequality, at systemic failure, and you have to actively listen to the voices of the weak, the marginalized, the ones history often forgets or silences. That, for Hugo, was the starting point.
Not just acknowledging misery, but confronting it.
Confronting it. That was his mission, to inspire that active exploration, that drive for social change.
Hugo ended Valjean's story with that simple, moving epitaph on his gravestone. He sleeps, though his fate was hard. He lived out the great heart of charity. He died, yet the light remains.
The light remains. That's powerful. It suggests that the struggle, the example, the moral force continues even after death. That light compels us, I think, to look inward at our own actions and outward at the world around us.
So building on that, here's the provocative thought we want to leave you, the listener, with today. Considering the persistent issues of poverty, judicial fairness, social bias, all the things Hugo wrote about that still plague our contemporary world, what miserable worlds, what specific systemic cruelties or injustices in our own time must we actively confront and work to dismantle if we are to truly honor that light left behind by those who seek justice?
A challenging question to end on.
Indeed. Thank you for diving deep with us into the world of Les Misérables.